Hello and good evening. My name is Nico Heller, and this is Reboot 2030, the Democracy School's YouTube channel. This is our second Reboot installment of this season, and it's a great pleasure to have with me today Professor John Davenport. John is a professor of philosophy at Fordham University in New York, and he teaches and researches on political philosophy, ethics, existentialism, moral psychology, and some topics within the area of the philosophy of religion. He's also the author of A League of Democracies, and he is currently working on a number of new books. The book he is here to discuss today is his latest, and it's called The Democracy Amendments, Constitutional Reforms to Save the United States. So John is here, so let me welcome him in. There he is. John, how are you doing? You need to unmute yourself. He kind of disappeared again, so he will have to come back in. So it's a really pleasure to have John here today because, of course, we've just had the midterm elections in the US. And so all eyes are on the machinery of democracy, if you like, in the US. There's been a lot of debate around the validity of elections, especially on the populist right. And so it's been quite interesting to observe these elections. And the question really that is, well, you know, the red wave that so many people had expected or had predicted, it didn't happen. And I guess what I'd like to know before we go into the debate, the substance of the discussion is well, what John thinks about this, and whether, well, given that it's been a fairly, from looking at it from the distance, a fairly civilized election this time compared to previous elections, whether some of the doubts whether it's really as bad as people think it currently is in the US. Now, of course, I lost him, and I am trying to get him back. I have no idea what happened, so I guess there he is. Let's see whether he manages this time. We'll try again. Okay. Now let's see. Okay. There he comes again. Let me see. Okay, and he's still okay. So I can see you, but you're still muted. So there's a button on your screen. Now you're there. Good.
Can you hear me? Yes, I'm very sorry. The Fordham University account makes you go through a zillion steps now, and it kicked me out of the meeting and made me log in again. So many apologies there.
No problem at all. I'm so glad that we found together. I have made a very brief introduction already. Told the few that you're working at Fordham University, a professor of philosophy, and that you are just about to come out with a new book, The Democracy Amendments, Constitutional Reforms to Save the United States. Well, let's sort of start with the current political situation, which I believe is still not settled. There've just been midterm elections. We expect, of course, the Republicans to take the House. We don't know it for sure yet, but we do know that they haven't taken the Senate. And there was this expectation that there might be a red wave, a Republican wave overrolling the country, and they would decimate the Democrats. That hasn't happened. These predictions were way off the mark. So my very first question, of course, are things really as bad as some people think, or are these elections proof that things are getting better?
Well, I understand why many people see this as positive news. It is relative to what it could have been. It could have been much worse. So you could look at it this way, Nico, that our situation in the United States has gone downhill so much in the last 10 to 15 years that now we look at results like this as encouraging. But really, I think that's a sort of, if you like, a false context or false background by which to compare and assess what we're seeing. We have to remember that many different officials across the country, both at the federal and state level, have been elected who deny the 2020 election outcomes. In Arizona, for example, I don't know if I think it's called now for the Democrat for governor, but this infamous woman, Carrie Lake, who almost won for Republican governor in Arizona, is one of the fiercest election deniers you'll ever find, and really a brutal kind of partisan extremist. She told even, John McCain supporters, a moderate Republican in his time, to get out of her campaign events. I mean, this woman still got at least 49% or 48.5% of the vote, something like that. So things are not, I think we're still in a pretty rough time. And after the next presidential election, there are a number of things that could go wrong. We could see presidential electors in our weird system for electing the president, who are appointed directly by state government rather than elected by voters. There's very likely to be a Supreme Court case in the next few months, maybe as late as summer of next year, that will enable state legislatures to do that. Just the thing that Trump and his operatives tried to get after the 2020 elections, try to get state legislatures to throw out who the voters elect and put in their own electors. So there are a number of things like that coming down the pike. I don't want to go on too much, but I'll give you just one other thing, important point about the House of Representatives. So it looks pretty clear that the Republicans are going to have the House. They need one or two more, confirmed wins for House seats. So the thing is, though, they would be nowhere close to winning. They would have lost the House decisively if it weren't for two things. The fact that in the states that they control, especially those states, which is almost half the states, where they have both branches of the state legislature and the governor, so they have kind of the trifecta, so they can put in any law they want. They have gerrymandered all the election districts that we use for our single member seats for the House of Representatives, enough to give them at least 7 or 8 seats, 6 to 7, maybe very conservative estimate, just from the way that they carved up district lines. For example, in Florida, they seem to have won, to do the math, I guess, 16 out of the 24 districts. No, it's more than that because it's 28. So they've won, I think, more than 2/3 of the districts in Florida. Even though in the party registrations, the state of Florida is maybe 48% Democrat. At one time, until pretty recently, Democrats were in the majority of elected or registered voters in Florida. But the gerrymandering alone, is giving them at least 3 or 4 seats in Florida.
But let me be the devil's advocate here. I mean, the American Constitution, is over 200 years old, and it served the country well. So you could say, well, there's nothing wrong with the Constitution. It's society that's kind of gone off the rails. So what is it? Is it society? Is it politics? Or is it the Constitution? Why do we now find us in a situation where the Constitution all of a sudden doesn't seem to serve its purpose anymore?
Well, I think it's both. It's both the Constitution and the structures that it leads to, and the results that has on the populace. People say, well, yes, it's the fault of the citizens because too many seem to have gone mad almost. They're trying to elect more and more extreme candidates. But part of the reason for that is that we can't pass laws very well anymore through the normal route in Congress because of the filibuster in the Senate, because of the sort of thing we're seeing in this House election that the majority of the House doesn't represent a majority of the country, because of the Supreme Court rejecting things that, even 2/3 or more of the American public want. So people get frustrated and they don't think that there's a constitutional problem behind this. They don't see the root cause of the issue. They just see the effects of the surface level symptoms. And they think, well, then what we need is a more extreme candidate who's going to get in there and do something. They tried that with Trump. It really didn't work. He, like Biden now will experience, could really only pass anything in the first 2 years.
But let me be once more the devil's advocate here. You could turn this round, couldn't you? And you could argue and say, well, the Constitution as it is by kind of, in a way, blocking the political process in so many instances, as you just described. It's actually a guarantor of stability. And many of the laws that would be passed would be so extreme that it would actually harm the country more than not passing in the first place. What do you say about that?
Right. Well, two things. I think a lot of Americans still believe that. And they think that, actually this is producing stability. The fact that we've got kind of minority rule in the Senate, which you would have even without the filibuster, because of the fact that every state has 2 senators, despite its population sizes, wildly varying by factors of almost 70 to 1. So yes, there's kind of minority control that makes it almost impossible to get laws passed through our system. But in the long run, I would argue that actually makes the system less stable because people lose faith in government. They don't believe that carrying elections is going to produce the desired result. And another result of that is that they never learn if they're mistaken about their policy preferences because they don't see them enacted. For contrast, if you look at parliamentary systems where people do get what they wanted or they get the platform for which they voted, except of course in a case like Liz Truss, where the prime minister is not elected but comes in because someone else resigned or lost a vote of no confidence. But when you elect somebody whose platform is mistaken or wrong in various respects, you'll see the results and you'll learn.
Let me be also, obviously, I hope you realize that I'm kind of with your argument, but I just want to kind of go through a number of kind of concerns that people might have or questions that people might raise. So let me just follow on with one more question. I mean, I suppose one of the kind of the fundamental changes that you'd like to see is a system that is moving more towards sort of proportional representation. Now, if you look at countries that have proportional representation, I just named 2, Israel and Italy. And if you look at those 2 countries and at the kind of extreme nature of politics in both of these countries at the moment, has that really been the solution?
Well, right. This is where you see, if you like, the downsides or the evils of a parliamentary system: instability, governments quickly rising and falling, elections too often. I mean, people in Israel must just be sick of going to the polls after so many in a row.
Is it 5 in 2 years or something?
Yes, so this is a genuine problem, but the United States is in no danger of running into those problems because I wouldn't even begin to propose a parliamentary system for this country. Americans would never accept it. All of the reforms proposed in my book, the democracy amendments, are ones that move only a little bit, or if you like, just modest steps away from the status quo. As a package as a whole, they would make an enormous difference. But they're not as radical, for example, as, say, just switching to a parliamentary system. You eliminate the presidency. You just have a prime minister, right? Those would be far too extreme steps to propose here. So what you could see in the United States, if ranked choice voting, some countries call this preferential voting, like you have in Australia, right, where you can rank your first, second, and your third choice candidates for any given office, that could produce and it would be good if it did, in my view, a few smaller parties that might rise to the point where they could get a few seats in the House of Representatives. They're very unlikely to win a whole state and get a senator at the moment. But what this would do is it would produce a situation where perhaps there did have to be some kind of coalition support to move things through the House of Representatives. This would be better, in my view, because it would force the 2 main parties to, if you like, move towards the middle and compromise, right? In order not to lose their seats to other new parties that are trying to occupy that middle ground, the political center, if you like, they would have to moderate, especially if we also reform the primary election system, which most often determines who's actually going to be your representative in the House of Representatives, given that we have so many safe seats due to gerrymandering. So these problems you have to understand sort of combine, and you have to disentangle what are the different root sources or causes of the problem. But in the United States, you could do this without destabilizing the system because it would be a long time before you would get to the point where, say, you had 3 parties of equal size or roughly equal power. It's hard to see that happening even with ranked choice voting for several decades. And instead, what you would see, right, is that the parties now, they try to, to at least get their candidates to be the preferred second choice. If you're a Green Party voter, the Democrats want you to rank their candidate as second choice when the Green Party doesn't win outright or doesn't have enough first place votes. If you're a Libertarian voter, the Republican Party wants you to put their candidate as your second choice. You can also do, I'm not sure if Israel has a rule like this or Italy, you can put a floor threshold or a bottom threshold on the percentage you need in order to be able to, to receive any representation in the House, right? You could say that.
That's right. I mean, in the German system, which also has proportional representation, there is sort of a threshold of 5% of the vote that you have to obtain in order to get, but not just to get a seat, but also to actually receive funding, for like to campaign in elections. So there's a financial hurdle and of course a parliamentary hurdle to be taken. And of course, you have two votes. You have got one vote for a candidate and you've got one vote for a party. And, so that basically gives you the proportional aspect of it. It kind of course, weakens democracy in a sense, because if you vote for a party you don't know, they go onto a party list, and the party then decides who fills that slot, and this may not be the candidate that you might have liked to see there. So, but let me just ask you one very last, again, sort of a devil's advocate question before we move on to your actual book and what you're proposing. It seems to me that constitutional reform in the US, in fact, most reforms, wherever you look and whatever you do, are very hard to be thought of as bipartisan reforms. There'll always be winners and losers. And it's hard to see you as a Republican. So clearly people would instantly say, well, surely he puts his arguments forward because he wants the Democrats to have, a better position in the body politics, and not just in elections, but also in Congress and so on and so forth. So what would you say to these people? To what extent is this also in the interest of the Republican Party and Republican voters? Why is this not, in your view, a partisan argument, but an argument in the interest of the public good, or, in everybody's interest?
No, great question. And maybe if you like, I can answer that. And if we have time, briefly come back to comment on the German system. There are two important points to maybe get in there. So to answer your question, though, I do think this is one of the biggest hurdles in order to sell a package or an agenda of constitutional reforms. And that's what this book tries to do, really to lay out a whole agenda, almost a comprehensive agenda, although the book doesn't actually cover every substantive question you would want to deal with. Things like abortion aren't discussed in it, for example, or birthright citizenship's controversial here now as well. But I try to argue in the first chapter of the book that people should look at these sort of procedural changes in, how we run election, how laws are made, how people get campaign finance, what's allowed in the sources of funding, and how much you can spend. One of the amendments deals with that. Changes in, ranked choice voting is another procedural amendment. Changes in how laws are made in Congress, whether you have a filibuster to block things in the Senate or not. I argue that people should evaluate these proposals based not on, well, how would my party now do under this system, but rather, what would my party become and how would it operate under so many, especially if we combine several changes. So you can't really imagine if you tried to redesign a game of football so that the rules were dramatically different, right? You now had a circular rather than a rectangular playing field, and you had two rather than one goal on each end, or you had three goalies rather than one. You can't now ask, well, how would Manchester United do playing in that situation? You would have a different team, right? I mean, people would build their teams differently based on different skills that were needed. By the same token, to give you an example from American races, if you say, well, we should get rid of the electoral college and directly elect the president, just by a majority vote across the country with ranked choice voting, you'd very likely get someone with an absolute majority after votes were reassigned, or pretty close to it, even if you had a number of third-party candidates running. Well, so they'll say, look, then Trump wouldn't have been elected in 2016 because Hillary Clinton did win the national popular vote. Same for George W. Bush in the year 2000. But this is a mistake because when Clinton and Trump ran in 2016, they weren't running to try to win the national popular vote. They were running to try to pick off those swing states that would give them the electoral college. They only campaigned, almost all their campaign stops were in 8 or 9 states. So you have to ask yourself instead, the right question is, well, how would a Republican Party, say they're running Ron DeSantis in 2024, how would their candidate do in a nationwide vote where the campaign aimed to win the popular vote? That's a completely different way of running the presidential election. So that empowers many, many more voters along the way, because now Republicans in New York State, which is a deep blue state, their vote counts towards the national total. And likewise, well, let's say Democrats in Texas, right, whose vote is zeroed out by the Electoral College because they didn't win Texas outright, their vote would count towards the national total. So hopefully you see what I mean. There's no way to simply imagine the current parties in their present way of acting and being operating under this new system. They would be different. They would be different parties.
I guess I think one of the key factors would be sort of the lead time, and I think we come to this and how this is kind of developed, and we come to this because you're talking about a constitutional convention as well, and we come to this in the second half of the talk, but why this might actually help in this process. Going back to the football analogy, what I find a more sort of fitting kind of idea is like if you would say, well, in future we're going to have 13 as opposed to 12 players. And some teams already have these extra players that are very good, but other teams may have to build them up first. So if you say you have 11 instead of 12, and then the choreography on the field changes, and you need different skill sets in different positions. And I think it's that kind of thinking. And of course, if you would give people time to build up to it, then the whole debate moves from the actual tactics on the playing field to the audience experience, the kind of the viewer experience. Does this make a better game of football or not? And then, of course, football teams might actually kind of fall into line and might see a future for themselves in an improved game. And I think this is, what you're kind of trying to get to, is that we need to improve the game so that people, and that is also the electorate and it's the voters, stay in the game and that politics is revitalized. Isn't that a fair way of sort of putting it?
That's right. As opposed to, no, that's absolutely correct. But the alternative that this country is facing now is that in order to win the football game, one of the teams is ready to burn down the stadium, right? And, accuse the umpires of
steal the goal.
Right. Accuse them of being planted by the other team and deny that their opponents scored a goal when everybody saw that they scored a goal, right? So we're getting to a point where the game is about to kind of collapse, and people will no longer agree to play it and recognize the outcome. Okay, my team lost this time and yours won. We'll have a rematch in a little while. Now, that's coming to a point where it could end, and the only alternative to these aspects of democracy is outright violence.
I think it's kind of clear where you're coming from. Now, my next kind of thing is moving on to the substance of your book. The democracy amendments, constitutional reforms to save the United States. From what I understand, you've identified more than 20 meaningful amendments. Although I don't know whether you kind of elaborate on every single one of those, but there is a very large number of amendments that you think would be necessary to really fix the problem. Now, it's a bit like a car. You get it serviced. And one thing, the brakes don't work, or this doesn't work. But when it builds up, at some point, you sort of say it's a write-off. And the question is the American Constitution at this point a write-off, or can it actually be reformed? Where do you start?
No, that's a great analogy. But you have to imagine instead that you own an old vehicle in Cuba, where allegedly you can't get new vehicles easily. So there's really there's no new cars for sale, right? You only have this one vehicle and it needs 20 new parts, but you're not going to, that would be the analogy I would offer. Unfortunately, there are some proposals out there. There was an interesting one published by the Democracy Journal not long ago, where like 20 scholars or so came together and wrote a whole new constitution. And I've seen that attempted a couple other times as well. It's very interesting what's produced. I think usually, I mean, if you're going to write a whole constitution, you have to address a lot of substantive issues as well. Like, should we change what's in the Bill of Rights? You know, should we change the right to privacy, rights to healthcare, women's rights concerning, you know, control of their womb, you know, abortion? Should you change a gun, rights to own a gun, which seem to be a big deal for a lot of Americans? So once you get into rewriting the whole thing, you have to face a lot of third rails, you know, really fiery issues that can drive people away quickly. So in the end, I think, although 25 amendments is a lot, that actually even just doing a few of them in the first round, it might take several rounds of constitutional reform to enact most of these needed changes. I think people could see that as an adaptation of what we're used to now, rather than scrapping completely the whole thing and starting anew. That would scare people off like mad. Unfortunately, because there's not very good civics education in the United States, that's one of the amendments actually would put that in place. People don't understand constitutional reform at all here. It's been so long now. It's been half a century since this country passed and ratified any constitutional amendment, at least of great substance. There was one that happened in the 90s. That's a funny story. But the last significant ones were the end of the poll tax and allowing people to vote at age 18 rather than 21. And another amendment passed to give Washington, D.C. representation in Congress back in 1978, I think, but it wasn't ratified in time. So people are not used to it now. And if you tell them we want to change the Constitution, they think that you're going to reinstate slavery, or that people's paranoias kick in like mad, that if you're going to make too many changes, maybe you're going to take away my rights. So you have to tell them, no, we're just trying to change some of the basic rules of the game so that it works better. Like, when we started to use automatic replay or the computer to judge whether the ball is in or out in tennis, it's just things like this that will improve the game. And so I think that introducing, if I actually say a constitutional convention was called, and we can talk about this more later if you like, but if I were going to such an event, I would probably suggest that we propose in convention maybe 10 or 12 of these amendments. And if the convention could adopt and propose half of them, say 6, went out there, say only 3 were ratified by enough states, that would be great. That would change everything, because when people saw, wow, 3 new amendments were ratified, an 18-year term on the Supreme Court, say, I think would be very popular. I think you could get Republicans to vote for that. The filibuster is gone, right, in the Senate. And maybe, some kind of a restriction on gerrymandering. That could actually be done through ordinary law, but it would be better if it was in the Constitution. Right? It would be more secure. Yes.
Let me, before we go on to the specific amendments that you're proposing, just in case people aren't aware of, what is actually involved in basically doing an amendment to the Constitution. What is the actual parliamentary process? What's the actual lawmaking process, constitutional process that has to be followed to bring about an amendment? If you could just talk us very briefly through what kind of majority is required and so on and so forth. How does the process work?
Right. There are 2 pathways. I'll start with the one that's been used. The other one's actually never been used, which is the convention pathway. So the United States Constitution is either the hardest or nearly the hardest constitution of any developed or advanced democracy in the world to change. And that's because when the founders wrote this document in 1787, and this part of it's never been changed since then. We haven't changed the amendment procedure itself by an amendment. They had very little to draw almost none of the states at the time, which were only a few years old, had any kind of very clear pathway towards changing the state constitutions. You also wouldn't find this much in European constitutions at the time because there were not many, right? And they were, either kind of, federalists or confederations for loose alignments of entities. Say in the Netherlands or in Switzerland would have been two examples. They had very little to go on and imagine in this. They knew that the previous confederation of states, which lasted about 10 years or 12 years after our Revolutionary War, couldn't be changed at all because it required unanimous consent of all 13 states to make any change to it. So they thought they were being progressive and radical by saying, well, no, you only need 2/3 of Congress, both chambers, House and Senate, to vote for an amendment, and then it can go to the states, which have to approve it by 3/4, not a unanimous consent, but only 3/4 of the states, or likewise through a convention. That could be by simple majority of the convention, which is interesting, not 2/3. And then again, 3/4 of the states to ratify or approve an amendment proposed by the convention or Congress. So it's a two-step process if you go through Congress and then to the states, but it's a three-step process if you first have to call a convention and then the convention proposes amendments and then they're ratified. So the second round is slightly more complicated, I can explain. But as I say, the founders thought they were making it easier to amend the Constitution in doing that, because the only point of comparison they had was a system where you required, unanimous consent to change, like we might have with certain treaties, right? You couldn't probably, well, if you wanted to change the treaties that constitute the European Union, you might not need unanimous consent. Well, you probably would, because if a country didn't agree with it, they would probably leave the European Union as a result of such a change. So,
at this point, you need unanimity, unfortunately, but that's a principle that quite a number of, especially pro-Europeans, are trying to get rid of, because unanimity is it's actually kind of quite anti-democratic. You get, in the case of Europe, you get countries like Hungary or Poland, who some would say are on the borderline of being democratic in many respects, and they can block progressive legislation. So unanimity is actually not necessarily the best way to go. But I'm sure
you're right. If I may just throw in, and another example is NATO, which has almost 30 members now, maybe a little more, and Turkey's holding up Sweden. Yeah, because you need all members of NATO to agree, which of course only gets harder every time you admit a new country. So it actually gets worse the more popular the organization is. So unanimous consent requirements, and the filibusters like this too to an extent, what they do is they reduce coordinative power. That's the underlying, if you like, mathematical point about it, is that either the ability to coordinate decisions that are binding on everyone and the ability to enforce them are reduced with requirements. The larger the supermajority, the max, of course, being unanimous consent, the lower your coordinative power. Whereas simple majority is the most powerful, obviously, for coordinating decision making. But you have to get everyone to agree to it. So the result in the American case is that it's become steadily harder over time to amend the Constitution because, the very problems that the flaws in the system cause, the extreme polarization of the country, the lack of civic education, the ability to kind of brainwash people through advertising that's paid for with big donations to campaigns and other independent spending because we have no limits on that. So all of these problems that are a result of the constitutional flaws now inflame the party divisions to such a point that it's unimaginable that you could get 2/3 majority to pass any amendment through Congress, let alone 3/4 of the states.
Are you
something simple?
This is a matter of interest. Are you referring to or referencing any? Because I mean, I'm aware of kind of two constitutional reforms. One in Africa, Kenya. I mean, after 2008, it had like at the election, there was massive tribal unrest and kind of bordering on civil war. I think 1,200 people died, large number of people died, many more got injured. And it really clouded the whole presidential campaign. And so they started a reform process. And in 2010, they brought in an entirely new and a brand new constitution. And I believe, although only parts of it have actually been implemented. I mean, they have a great constitution, but isn't really been implemented fully. But having said that, it has served in my view, from what I can see, its primary purpose to somehow reduce the tribal tensions, because they brought in a middle tier of government, like a regional government. They brought in counties, and they kind of brought in this sort of regional government, and that massively kind of diffused tensions and really helped.
Subsidiarity, right?
That's right. So it's an imperfect process, and it's imperfectly implemented, but it has actually served the purpose. And of course, the big example of a very successful constitutional reform, of course, is Ireland. I don't know whether you're aware, and they had, of course, a constitutional, convention, and that is often quoted as a very successful example of how to do constitutional reform. Are you using any examples of successful constitutional reforms to make your case, or are you sort of shying away from that?
Well, it's unfortunate. I wish I had more room in the book. It's already longer than it should be. And I would have included those kind of comparisons with other countries. Another interesting example would be Iceland recently went through a process where, they kind of tested out what people thought by using citizen juries to make proposals. And then I believe some of them were adopted by the parliament or proposed to the people for ratification. Another case would be South Africa, although much more difficult in many respects. But it's easier in countries that have had a parliamentary system of some kind or another, I think, to put changes out to the people and say, we're going to ratify this by, a nationwide plebiscite. Since that we've never had that in this country, it would seem revolutionary to do that. And there are some American reformers. Sandy Levinson, one of the most renowned constitutional scholars of the last half century in the United States, and Akhil Amar, a professor of law at Yale University. And there are a few others, but those two most prominently have proposed that we do just what you described. Let's hold a convention. Let's write a new document. We could copy a lot of the old in the places where it's good, and then change the rest, and then put it to the people of the United States. If they vote, by 51% for it, it's done. I think this country's not ready for that. I wish it were. I think if you did that, you would only have civil war. And there are a lot of guns in private hands in this country. It wouldn't be pretty. So I don't think, if people got used to a process of constitutional reform, say we had gone through, as I was suggesting, one convention that, 3 or 4 amendments got ratified out of it. People now see, oh, okay, so this is what constitutional reform is. Now, I have a significant vote in the presidential election because we elected directly. I see that more things are passing the Senate now. Not all of them are good. We made a couple mistakes. We have to go and repeal those laws and stuff. But people see now how constitutional change can produce progress. They start to believe in it as a useful means of dealing with the things that are bugging them the most and making them most angry. Then you would have kind of the foundation of public trust on which you then might be able to, take this more radical kind of step and rewrite the whole thing kind of more fully, which is basically what they did in 1787. So you could compare that a little bit more to, say, like the situation in South Africa. Well, I guess that's not really a very good comparison. The problems among the states, though, were so bad that they were ready to break into 3 or 4 regional alliances. So they would have maybe been at war with each other, or at least extreme tensions. And they could have been picked off by various European powers. The French and the Spanish and the British might each have allied with one of those 3 groups of 4 or 5 states, or 3 or 4 states. And you can imagine how bad that the results would have been. So the convention said, look, we just have to scrap the old Articles of Confederation. They're no good. And given the situation that resulted, it was very clever, right? Because people knew that they couldn't live with the status quo. They recognized that it was going to destroy them. And so their only other salient option was the one that was proposed by the convention. A number of people hated it, and they were gnashing their teeth and wailing and angry. You can imagine the large states like Virginia were very angry about the way the Senate was composed of equal senators from each state. So unfair. Rhode Island has 1/12 the number of people that, Virginia's at least 10 or 11 times more people than Rhode Island and Delaware. It's gotten 6 times worse than that ever since, but they had no other alternative. The problem is, that wouldn't be the case now, right? If you proposed a new document, that kind of compiled everything into one big amendment, let's say, people would just see that as like, you're trying to shove all this down my throat at once. No, and you might not even get a simple majority, let alone what you need for a full, yeah.
There's one last question that's sort of very much in the back of my mind, and that takes it to the sort of the international or the global level. I mean, it's one thing for Ireland or for Iceland or say for Kenya to reform its constitution. It's another thing for like the United States, who's sort of, if you like, the kind of the global leader in so many respects. Economically, militarily, and some would say also in terms of democratic values, although I think, the jury is out there, but there is this sort of thing about, being in that leadership position, you're much more, it's much harder to change, isn't it? It's like then to be in the shadows, it's like if you're a small country like Iceland, then whatever you do, it's probably going to affect you most and other people less so, but right. It's like when the EU kind of thinks about constitutional reform, then the world holds its breath because there's implications for trade and all the rest. And of course, right. the same or to an even greater extent that would go for the US. Do you think that is a factor that might hold reform back?
Well, in a way, my answer would be I wish it would. That might sound paradoxical, but what I mean is that too many Americans don't know enough about the role that the U.S. plays in global affairs to even understand the importance of constitutional change here in that regard. They would if education were changed here to require, say, 2 semesters of civics, which would include, some of how the United States makes foreign policy and its effects on the rest of the world. But people in leadership positions here in politics, they all understand, including most of the Senate, that what we do, has great effects on the rest of the world. And it's really bad when we're trying to, resist propaganda coming from Putin's, trolls and his bots, and the rising appeal of dictatorship, it seems, to more and more people in different countries around the world. The appeal to a kind of brutal kind of ethno-nationalism that you see in what originally brought Putin's rise to power. It might be eroding a little now, but the same kind of thing obviously at work in China, with almost kind of veiled, but not very veiled suggestions that there's almost like even a racial superiority, and very definitely at least a cultural superiority that's being suggested by the Chinese Politburo. So we're dealing in a world in which dictators have rising influence and authoritarianism is challenging democracy. It's terrible in that situation for the United States to be weakened by its internal problems. So absolutely, that is an important aspect of this. But that threat, right, to the U.S. world leadership, I don't think would move many Americans. You might get 10 or 15% would listen to that argument. I wish it were more. But nevertheless, even if people don't understand it, it is an important reason why we need to avoid a collapse of the system here. And I do say that in the book. If that happens, the only winners will be President Putin and President Xi.
That's right. And of course, elites on both the Democratic and the Republican side will, as you said, will understand too. And I suppose it will be to some extent an elite game. So in terms of who's going to decide whether there is going to be a constitutional reform or not, it's probably going to be decided at a political level, and the awareness would be there at that level.
Well, but if I just insert, I mean, things are getting so bad that in the 2016 election, Trump welcomed Russian interference in the election. And I think, I mean, given that people will believe apparently whatever this kind of demagogue says, there are a lot of Americans now. People accuse Tucker Carlson of this on Fox News here, of maybe being like, well, okay, if foreign interference in the election and stealing or breaking into the opposition's campaign, stealing data from them, releasing it on WikiLeaks and stuff, if this will help us, the view seems to be among too many Republicans, by any means necessary, it doesn't matter how evil, how corrupt, how wrong or unjust, if it will help us win. So one has to find a way of deterring and kind of ratcheting that back, and understanding that if you do that, if you go too far down that route, well, then, too much of the leadership in both main parties might end up actually being, to some extent, puppets of other people around the world. I mean, these are huge dangers. I do stress this is in the kind of the later chapter. I put the top 10 amendments up front, but in the third chapter, where 15 others are detailed, I have one that deals directly with this question of foreign intervention in campaigns. And people don't understand that, there's a danger also of blackmail. If you've hacked into or have a lot of personal data from a lot of different members of Congress, right? And you can threaten to release that data if they don't vote, say, to remove tariffs on, or sanctions on Russia, or you could see this is not a conspiracy theory. There's a detailed document by the FBI on this risk. Oh, yeah. So this, I think Americans will understand if pressed. This point will register with people, and they'll see, okay, I see there's a danger of blackmail. We need to ensure that our campaigns aren't being funded or helped by this kind of foreign interference. And I actually have a whole raft of good governance reforms, which these don't get a lot of discussion. They're not like the filibuster or the presidential election. They're not kind of hot button topics. But when presented to the average American, you might find that 70, 80%, maybe more, 90% in some cases would agree with these. They're simple good governance reforms to remove conflicts of interest, to prevent foreign influence on campaigns and things like that.
So let's have a quick look at your top 3 amendments, just to bring it down to a very practical level again, because we've been talking very high level, yes, which I think is really, really important. But what you actually are contributing here to the debate is something very practical in your book, and we don't want to lose sight of this. So maybe if you give us 3 examples in a nutshell, how they would drastically improve the body politics and politic making in the US today.
Yes, I tried to prepare an answer for this, Nico, and I wrote down 5 things. So I'm not doing too well.
5 then, please.
But yes, I do have trouble with this. I go back and forth with which ones to put in the top 3. Definitely, the first one, if I could just change by pressing a button or waving a magic wand, I would eliminate the filibuster.
Okay.
Because I think the result of that would be, well, for example, if there had been no filibuster in the last 2 years, then a package of reforms to American elections would have passed. Gerrymandering would have been not eliminated, but greatly suppressed. And there would have been far fewer restrictive voter laws, which states have adopted in the last couple of years. And I think the Democrats would have won the House of Representatives, as I started by saying.
But then we're back to a partisan argument here.
Well, yes, but right, that sounds like a partisan argument. But my point is that this one change enables so many other things. It's sort of like, removing the barrier in a dam. The floodwaters then flow, and people might not like the results. But then what do? They have to elect a Republican majority. They only need 51 senators now, and then they can reverse all of these changes if they want. I'd like to see them try to do that. How popular it would be, you try to imagine, right, that the filibuster had been eliminated, the Voting Rights Act, the new Voting Rights Act had been enacted. There's an important piece of history on that I can come back to. It's shocking. But it didn't, right? Because of the filibuster, the so-called For the People Act passed the American House, but not the Senate due to the filibuster. Then what you would see, I think, is just, a shift to a new equilibrium, right? The Republican Party would start to take advantage of the fact that there's no filibuster. And they would pass, they could no longer grandstand and say, oh, I want to pass a bill that bans all abortions nationwide. And vote for me because this is what I want to do. And a lot of, the more extreme party base will vote for this. If they actually could pass that through the Senate, would they actually dare to do it, right? That now we are calling the bluff, if you see what I mean, right? So its effect on politics would be great. The incentive to just keep a problem going in order to fundraise off of it, which is a very perverse incentive that now operates in the US Congress. We almost the last thing we want to do is resolve the immigration problem on the southern border, because then people would think, okay, that's done, on to the next stuff, right? No, if you're a Republican strategist, you want that problem to remain,
of course,
like a wound that never heals, so you can keep milking it for all it's worth. So the filibuster, yes, you see that.
Absolutely.
And then, should I name two others, or do you want to ask something about that?
Go ahead.
So then after that, I think I would go to the 18-year term for the Supreme Court, partly because I consider it low-hanging fruit. I think there's so many conservative lawyers and commentators who've approved it. Now, that is an issue that you really would have to see how you phase that in, because some Republicans would see that as, oh, you want to get rid of Trump's justices and stuff. So you have to phase it in a way that doesn't threaten that. The explanation to people has to be, what this does, as soon as it's fully phased in, is it ensures that each president will nominate 2 justices. You have 9 and you have an 18-year term. What happens is 2 retire every 4-year term. So you connect it with the presidential term. What happens if somebody dies or retires early or whatever? You replace them with either by lottery or some other mechanism from our appeals courts, the circuit courts of appeals that we've got here. So the president isn't involved. This greatly depoliticizes the Supreme Court, because there's no longer these huge stakes fights to put someone in there who's going to be there for 30 years. The term is more limited. With the amendment should also go requirements for the Senate to vote in a certain amount of time. So you couldn't see what happened to Obama's last appointee, Merrick Garland, during his last term, where the Senate just refused to vote. You would see a more regular order. It would ratchet down, the issue of both, when is somebody going to retire? How could we get them to do that? And then the partisan fight over confirmation in the Senate. All of this is greatly reduced. It would remove one of the great goads or instigators to partisan extremism in the United States, and I think help the whole political culture. People would know, look, when I vote for president, I'm also voting for two court justices. He's going to nominate, or she's going to nominate a couple people. You could imagine presidential candidates even putting out, like, if I win, I'm going to nominate these 2 people. I mean, if they thought that would help them win the election, right? So it would just connect it with the presidential election. So that I also think is very productive and eminently doable if it's posed in the right way. You're not getting rid of current justices. And then the third, I decided after thinking about it more that I think the campaign finance reforms needed here might be the most important, because again, it's not exactly low-hanging fruit. It would be a partisan fight. But if you poll Americans, more than 2/3 of them think the so-called Citizens United verdict from the Supreme Court here was wrong. That was the verdict that, along with an earlier decision from the 1970s, allowed kind of unlimited money in American politics. In many cases, it doesn't even have to be disclosed. The real kicker with that verdict from the Supreme Court was that it allowed unlimited spending by corporations and other, very wealthy people through so-called independent groups. There's still limits on what you could give to a candidate and their official campaign, but that almost doesn't matter. because you could just buy as many advertisements on TV or, create your own radio show to publicize your views. And so that's all basically unlimited ever since Citizens United. Imagine what people in Georgia are going to go through, having just been through this 2 years ago, with the avalanche of election advertising before the runoff for the Warnock perhaps getting reelected to the American Senate in Georgia.
But,
if the Senate majority turned on it, it would have even been worse, right? You could have seen many millions of dollars of advertising in Georgia in the next 2 weeks.
well, I mean, these midterm elections, the ones which just gone through, from what I understand, were the most expensive elections in the history of the United States.
Oh yeah,
An overall price tag of over 70 billion. I mean, this
it's
is
insane.
this is absolutely crazy. And of course, it totally voids the notion of democracy, because of course, I mean, I think one of the things that I thought was really impressive about Obama's campaign at the time was the small donations aspect of it. The micro donations, the $10, $20, $50 that people would put in through the the platform that whatever it was called, MoveOn.org.
Right.
Was it? Yeah.
Yes.
And I think that was an amazing mobilization, sort of grassroots mobilization, and you had a sense that ordinary people could put their money where their mouth is. But on the whole, it's a big boys game, isn't it? It's kind of big corporates. It's the billionaires game, and ordinary people sort of tend not to have their voice heard.
And it doesn't end with the election, because then once you're in Congress, you will be influenced in what laws you pass by the lobbyists who are coming to talk with you and being like, listen, this is our view, the people I represent, this is what we think. And there's no like, if you don't vote for this, we're not going to give you any campaign money. At least usually they don't come right out and say that, but it's implied, right? Often without even having to spend money, just the threat of it can operate. So the figures you just looked at don't tell even that doesn't tell the whole story, because you have members of Congress who think, well, if I don't enact this law, if I block this proposed bill, or I change something in a proposal that increases taxes on hedge fund managers, for example, that's one that keeps getting extended. They keep getting that. People try to eliminate it, and it constantly remains in the bill, no matter what they do, because their lobby is so strong. If I vote to change this or close this tax loophole, my funders will then give huge amounts of money to a primary challenger, right? And since we have so many safe seats through gerrymandering, again, the primary election is so important in many congressional districts. So without even spending a dollar, they have bought the law, right? Because of the mere threat of it. To keep that threat alive and realistic, they spend a certain amount of money, which is what I have actually many charts and figures in this book. It's hard to do, a philosopher's not used to doing this kind of work with tables and charts and graphs. But if you look at the one on all the ones, I have 3 on campaign spending. They measure different things. The line is steadily upwards, right? Or I should go from your perspective this way, right? It never comes down, right? I mean, and the change after Citizens United is enormous, right? I mean, the huge jumps upwards, both in what campaigns are spending, and independent spending. And then if you break it out by like the presidential versus the congressional elections, they're all getting more expensive, to the point where it looks, and it simply is, an arms race. As if you studied any social science, and an arms race is a prisoner's dilemma, right? That takes the form of a prisoner's dilemma. That's the kind of collective action problem it is. So it's almost like people blame the members of Congress for being corrupt, and a few of them are. But the way I explain it in the book is, look, that it's more like, imagine that you're one of many small business owners in a small town in southern Italy back in the 1950s, right? So you and 100 other small shopkeepers, well, there's 2 different mafia groups, and each one protects different shop owners, right? If you don't pay the mafia group whatever they claim you owe them per week or per month, they'll stop protecting you, and the other mafia group will devour you. That's the situation that members of Congress are in. It's, because it's an arms race, they have to take the money, they have to take the support from big donors. You can't make it up completely with the small donations, at least not yet. And so they're caught. The system perpetuates itself. What the amendment that I propose would do, and it's a complicated amendment, unfortunately, because there are a lot of moving parts to this. It's also difficult to explain to students. People don't understand because the laws that we have are so convoluted. I go through the history in that part of the book in quite a lot of detail. But the amendment, what it would do is it would boost that small donation component. What you do is you say the government will give you a transferable voucher, $50, $100 maybe. You can allot that or divide it into maybe 4 or 5 pieces, give it to whichever candidate you want, and maybe also to an independent group like the League of Women's Voters, or if you support the NRA for guns, you could give it to them, or maybe an environmental organization like the World Wildlife Fund. All of these groups do lobbying here, right? So the voter doesn't get that money, but they can give it to someone else.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, is where you need like the threshold, like the 5 or 10% comes into play with small parties. Otherwise, you could get people running just to get that money and give their wife a job or their husband a job or something. So you do have to have some protections. But so that's one part of the amendment, that transferable voucher that would empower small donations. But the other part has to be spending caps. It just has to reverse spending, Citizens United. And that's tough because conservatives here sometimes argue that, look, it's a free speech issue. But it really isn't, because if I take up every minute available in a public meeting, they say it's 3 hours and I hold the floor for 3 hours and no one else gets a chance to speak. Is that my free speech right? No, I mean, I'm, curtailing other people's right to speech. It's very much like that with the election advertising. It crowds out everything else, right? The onslaught. Yeah.
And of course, I mean, the other thing that would happen there as well, it's not just the crowding out, but it also drives up prices. So, the space, because it's demand and supply, so that the advertising time that is available gets more expensive. So so I think this has been really, really interesting. But let me ask you to give us just a really short pitch why you think that a constitutional convention would be the way to go. 3 minutes.
Right. I realize that we're running out of time. Well, my computer won't show me the clock, but yes. So, boy, this is a big one. And I think most likely to be shocking to many readers, because unfortunately at the moment, the idea of calling a new convention has become associated with a far right group called the Convention of States. All they want to do is sometimes they want to pass a balanced budget amendment, but they also want to give states more power and reduce the federal government's power. So, for example, we would have been able to do even less to coordinate a response to COVID when it came. That's not at all, of course, the agenda proposed in my book, but the convention route, what it does is it gets around the roadblocks in Congress. It appeals to the populism that's at work in the country right now, because people can say, yes, the state governments can call this convention directly without Congress being able to stop it. That's not completely true. There's actually a small fly in that ointment, or a small hitch with that. I can come back to if time permits. But in principle, when 2/3 of the states say we want a new convention, Congress is supposed to arrange it, and then it can meet. Then you have 2 other advantages with that route. First, as I was mentioning, the convention can just make proposals or pass them out of convention by simple majorities. They don't need to vote by 2/3. There's a question of how you decide, how states are going to be represented within the convention. Should they be equal numbers of delegates from each state? Should they be more from California and less from a small state? So you have that battle. That I make detailed proposals on all these things. Maybe some compromise, like you could have maybe 5 delegates from the largest states and 1 from the smallest states.
The interesting example in Ireland, of course, is that they kind of had politicians, but they also had ordinary citizens take part in the convention, and that
Exactly.
actually proved highly beneficial, because it kind of opened the black box, and it made this a much more transparent and a much more trustworthy process. I mean, you might have thoughts on that too.
I do, yeah, and then I'll come back to the last advantage of the convention that I didn't get to. The way I suggest it, and at the moment this would have to be done by Congress writing a law when they call the convention together and organize it. I would suggest that no politician be allowed to. I think it could be done. They could bring experts with them. Each state delegation could bring one or two, but I would suggest that the law say, because there's no details in the Constitution about this at all. The law say that no one who presently serves in the federal or any state government could come. Now, people work for small county or township governments, fine. But yeah, and that even more strongly, maybe they can't work for government 4 or 5 or 10 years after the convention ends. So you really do make this a people's convention, right? And again, the experts can come and guide relative newbies who don't, understand the ins and outs of different constitutional problems. But that to me would be the ideal convention. And so you have people who aren't, worried about a primary challenge, if they don't say the right thing, and aren't worried about big lobbies, but thumb their nose at those guys. And even better still, if we followed what the original convention did, it's amazing how they stuck to this. It would be closed, so the proceedings would be secret, and the big lobbies couldn't, run massive advertising campaigns to try to, to sort of shortcut or to sabotage what they were doing. Now, that would simply happen probably after the convention made its proposals. But at that point, the excitement, right, from the popular involvement, I think it would snowball so quickly, it would become unstoppable, right? Once you called a convention and it actually met, and, by hook and crook or miracle, it managed to pass 5, 6, 7 proposals, people would not accept, I think, the result that they're all just negated by all the states. I think people would want something positive to come out of it. I think at this point, the big lobbies and the big foundations that, sometimes serve as lobbies here would be, they would just be outgunned. They would be overwhelmed.
Of course, you have one aspect, one thing going for you in the US that we don't have in Germany, and that is trial by jury. So the members of the convention would be like jurors in a trial, and very similar rules would apply in terms of them being influenced and so on and so forth.
Like a sequestered jury. That's exactly the analogy I use.
So in the US, there's trust in the jury system. In Germany, people would say, how can a lay person ever kind of be involved in that capacity? It's a judge's responsibility to, and so of course the US has a major advantage here in terms of actually doing this, because people understand the concept of the jury, so they would understand the responsibility they enter into if they take part in a convention.
That's a good point that you made. I wish I might have to squeeze that in the copy edited version of the manuscript about the difference from Europe in that respect, because I do lean heavily on the jury analogy. And you're right. I think most people here do trust juries. I mean, they don't always get it right, but they're pretty reliable, and people usually agree.
The principle is trusted. The principle is trusted. There's always the O.J. Simpsons of this world where the whole thing breaks down. But but the principle is trusted. Even to this day, where politicians are no longer trusted, juries are on the whole. And I think that's a really interesting aspect there.
And so I don't know if I have a minute left, but I would say, that process through a convention, it just would create such excitement, right? Every school would be teaching about it, right? If children's competitions going on, like, what do you think should be changed in the Constitution? It would create just such an unstoppable kind of a movement. That I really do think that the spoilers, the naysayers that so dominate our system now, it would just be a total end run, which is the analogy we use in American football, around these kind of obstacles or roadblocks in the current system. It would be so great for the country. Even if the convention didn't produce that much, just to have gone through it, I think would sort of change the political atmosphere. The difficulty or the sticking point is to get Congress to accept that 34 states have called for it. How can they hold this up? Would the Supreme Court intervene? It could be a mess actually trying to get from the states calling to, a convention meeting. That's the part that worries me the most. But yeah, I think it would change everything. And it's the most likely route to succeed, given the difficulty of, if you pass amendments one by one through Congress, every lobbyist in the world is going to jump on that. They're not dealing, with several amendments at once. That's the final advantage I'll mention of a convention is, which should be obvious from the history of the first convention, is they can make deals, right? They can connect one amendment with another and just wrap them into one amendment. So they say things like, the example I use in the book is, you want a balanced budget amendment? Many conservatives want that. I can see the reasons. I talk about our annual deficits in one section, but many liberals don't like that, right? The balanced budget amendment. Okay, so let's connect that with direct election of the presidency. We'll give you a version of your balanced budget amendment, but at the same time, we're going to eliminate the electoral college. See, a convention can do that. You'll never do that.
See, but the other thing is, and I think this is an interesting aspect as well. I think one of the sort of the general sort of experiences with conventions, citizens conventions, citizens assemblies, is that that they don't necessarily sort of deploy the same transactional mindset that you get in formal politics. Right. They are, it's a different kind of negotiating logic that actually kind of unfolds, because you're not looking at professional. Yeah, that's right. You're not looking at people that are used to representing interests and bartering in that kind of sense, but they're coming to it from a personal, ethical point of view. What would be good for me? What would be good for my family? And that's where they would sort of start. And
exactly right. Now, I think, when it comes down to brass tacks, you could see a few bargains or deals being made. But you're right. I think it would start out in a convention, as long as the whole atmosphere wasn't poisoned by the process of delegate election, I guess, which could happen. I mean, that could be difficult. You would hopefully have delegates there who were willing to start, in a kind of friendly conversation way, with the guidance of experts who hopefully would, help that process along. So that's right. The convention, I think, it's untried. But as
far as the kind of the support of experts is concerned, again, the jury situation is a good comparison. I mean, like in jury trials, again, you will have experts advising the jury.
Exactly.
Both on the forensic analysis of what is actually the problem or what is, the crime in the case of the jury, right down to different solutions and what's the law and all the rest, so that people can use their own common sense to navigate those constraints.
So you could imagine in convention that, today, delegates, we're going to hear from 4 experts, on whether we should increase the size of the House of Representatives. That's another amendment in the book, or give them weighted votes so that they're more proportional to the states. We're going to have, 2 experts who oppose this and, 2 who think something, that something like this should be done, and hear the pros and cons, and then effectively the citizen jury there would weigh those arguments. That's right. That would be, in the ideal case, how a convention should work. The book ends, the last proposal in the book is an amendment that would, sort of write all this itself into the Constitution of how a convention should work. Unfortunately now, though, given the present Constitution we've got, we're stuck with Congress doing it right. So Congress has to write a law that structures the convention process in a way that makes it likely to work, rather than sabotaging it. So
yes.
maybe this could be done, because now that the Republicans will control the House and the Democrats the Senate, maybe they could come to some compromise. Or given that elected politicians could stand to lose from some of the amendments produced by convention, they might just stall forever and say, no, we don't consider that we've got, there are tricks they can use to say that we don't think that 34 states have validly called for a new convention, so we're not going to do anything. then maybe the Supreme Court would have to intervene, which would be most unfortunate.
It would be.
You get the picture.
I mean, it is a difficult process, but I think it is really important at this point to, as you say, and I think your book very much is kind of making a major contribution here to think about the options and the possibilities we have. So it's not just doom and gloom, but the actual pathways to a better functioning, a more just and a more sustainable democratic system. And I think what your book is doing is making a viable contribution to that. So it's the democracy amendments, constitutional reforms to save the United States. Do you know when it's coming out?
Well, I hope to have the production schedule soon. It could be, I'm not sure how long all these steps will take, but I think by early summer or very late spring in 2023, should have this book well before the next presidential election, when all bets are off and who knows what will happen. All these, potential machinations regarding the Electoral College. See, that itself, I mean, there's a sense in which as things get worse and people see, how dangerous the situation is getting, that can actually motivate a willingness to consider constitutional reform. I think we saw it a little bit in this last election, the question you started with. People were starting to worry about, should I really vote for this radical MAGA, candidate who wants to, to deny every election that they lose? People might see that, maybe in a way it would be a good thing if we had a problem with the Electoral College in 2024. I hesitate to say that. I don't want to see people killed in the streets by mobs, for Lord's sake. But I think if a problem like this happens, for example, what you might see is a swing state, like a close state, like Georgia or North Carolina. After the Supreme Court says that they can do this, they might say, well, it looks like 51% of people in North Carolina voted for Biden or Kamala Harris or whoever's running for Democrat. Maybe Rock Johnson, that would be a better candidate, maybe. And so then the legislature of North Carolina says, I don't know, I don't like these ballots. There were problems with them, I'm alleging. We're going to take over this process. And you know what? The legislature is going to appoint Republican electors. That's, see, when the lid comes off the boiling pan at that point. I mean, that's the sort of problem I anticipate we could have, but it might at least kind of galvanize attention, and people will realize, wow, we really need to do something. Even worse, but we're probably not likely to get to this. I'm trying to imagine the shock Americans will feel when the House of Representatives ends up selecting a president. And that can happen under this system. If no one wins an outright majority of the Electoral College, because say a third party candidate has won a couple states, wow, then the House selects the president, but only by each state delegation taking one vote. So, having a majority of states delegations in the House means you would capture the presidency. I mean, I just think, I think it could spark civil war. It's a disaster for the country.
It could. So, it could. Absolutely.
We're heading in that way.
It could. John, I'm very, very aware of time. This has been an amazing conversation, and I know you're not too well today. You have been holding up incredibly well. I can hear it slightly, but you're very clear, and your voice, you're oiling your vocal cords. Absolutely brilliant. And it's been really, really nice. I'm looking forward to the book. If your publisher sends out, proof copies, I'd love to get a signed copy in the post. It would be a great pleasure.
And so if we talk again next year, I can tell you how many death threats I've received.
For example, exactly. So, John, thank you very, very much. It's been really great pleasure and a great privilege to talk to you about this new book. And I hope we're going to keep this conversation going into the future. For now, I wish you, all the best. I hope you're going to be back to good health very, very soon. And thank you for coming on. It's been a really interesting conversation.
It's a pleasure, Nico. Thank you so much. This was great. Very helpful, actually.
Thank you very much. All the best. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.